The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. David rolled over in his tiny studio apartment, groaning as he felt the familiar ache in his shoulders from yesterday's shift. The apartment wasn't much to look at: a bed, a small kitchen table, and a keyboard he'd bought secondhand from a pawn shop. But it was home, and more importantly, it was all he could afford. He stumbled to the bathroom and looked at himself in the cracked mirror. 25 years old, but the stress lines around his eyes made him look older. His hands, once soft and nimble from years of piano practice, now had small scars from kitchen burns and calluses from carrying heavy trays. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist anymore. These were the hands of someone just trying to survive. David pulled on his crisp white uniform and straightened his black tie. The Grand Plaza Hotel demanded perfection from its staff, and he'd learned long ago that even the smallest wrinkle could mean a lecture from the supervisor. He grabbed his worn leather messenger bag, a graduation gift from his parents that now seemed like it belonged to a different person entirely. The bus ride to work was always the same. He'd sit in the back, watching the city wake up through dirty windows. Business people in expensive suits rushed past, talking loudly into their phones about deals and meetings. David used to be like them once, full of dreams and ambition. Now, he just hoped he could make it through another day without dropping anything. At the hotel, he punched in exactly at 6:45 a.m. The employee break room buzzed with the usual morning chatter. His coworkers were good people, mostly students working their way through school or single parents trying to make ends meet. They all had their own stories, their own struggles. David kept his past to himself, though. It was easier that way. "Morning." "David," called out Rosa, an older woman who worked in housekeeping. She always had a kind word for everyone, despite working 2 jobs to support her grandchildren. "You look tired, honey." "You okay?" "Just another day," David smiled back, appreciating her concern. Rosa reminded him of his grandmother, who used to sit beside him at the piano when he was little, clapping enthusiastically even when he hit wrong notes. The morning briefing was routine. The hotel manager, Mr. Peterson, went through the day's events with military precision. "We have the Harrison wedding in the Rose Garden, a corporate lunch in the Oak Room, and tonight... He paused dramatically. "Tonight is the monthly VIP gathering in the Grand Ballroom. I want everyone on their best behavior. These guests spend more on wine than most people make in a year." David nodded along with the others, but his mind wandered to the Grand Ballroom. It was the most beautiful room in the hotel, with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. And right in the center, like a sleeping giant, sat the most magnificent piano he'd ever seen. A Steinway grand piano, worth more than he'd make in 5 years. The first half of his shift passed in a blur of coffee service and breakfast cleanup. David moved through the motions automatically, his body knowing exactly what to do while his mind drifted elsewhere. He thought about his old life when music was everything. He'd practiced 8 hours a day, dreaming of Carnegie Hall and recording contracts. His parents had sacrificed so much for his education, working extra shifts and taking out loans they couldn't really afford. Then came the phone call that changed everything. His father's voice shaking with emotion, explaining that the family business had gone under. Medical bills from his mother's cancer treatment had piled up. The house was being foreclosed. His college fund was gone. Just like that, his dreams crumbled like a house of cards. "David, table 12 needs their water." "Refilled," his supervisor's voice cut through his memories. He snapped back to reality, grabbing a pitcher and heading to the dining room. The lunch crowd was typical for a Tuesday: business meetings and ladies who lunch. David served them with a smile, taking their orders and making small talk about the weather, but inside he felt invisible. These people looked right through him, as if he was just part of the furniture. He wondered what they would think if they knew he could play Rachmaninoff from memory, or that he'd once performed at Lincoln Center as a student after lunch service. David had a precious 30-minute break, instead of going to the employee lounge. Like the others, he had a different routine. He slipped up to the mezzanine level, where a small window looked down into the Grand Ballroom. The room was empty now, being set up for tonight's event. And there it was, the piano, gleaming under the soft lighting. His fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory kicking in. He could almost feel the keys beneath his fingertips, could almost hear the music flowing through the empty space. Sometimes, late at night when the hotel was quiet, he would sneak down there. The cleaning crew knew him and looked the other way. For 20 minutes, maybe 30 if he was lucky, he could pretend he was someone else. Someone who mattered. The afternoon brought a new wave of guests and responsibilities. David carried luggage, delivered room service, and answered countless questions about local attractions. His feet ached, but he pushed through it. He needed this job. Without it, he'd end up back in his hometown, watching his parents struggle even more because of his failed dreams. As evening approached, the hotel transformed. The grand ballroom filled with men in expensive tuxedos and women in designer gowns. David changed into his evening uniform, still white but more formal. Tonight, he would serve champagne and hors d'oeuvres to people who spent more on a single piece of jewelry than he made in 6 months. He watched from the service entrance as the guests mingled and laughed. They seemed so carefree, so confident. David tried not to feel bitter about it. These people had worked hard for their success too, he reminded himself. But still, it stung to see what his life might have been like in a different world. The evenings. Entertainment was supposed to be a string quartet, but David's attention kept drifting to the piano. It sat there, silent and waiting, like it was calling to him. He shook his head, focusing on his job. Dreams were for other people now. He was just the help, invisible and forgotten. But as he carried his tray of champagne flutes through the crowd, David couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be different. He didn't know why, but something in the air felt charged with possibility. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, but for the first time in months, he felt a tiny spark of hope flickering in his chest. The piano waited in the corner, patient and beautiful, as if it knew that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the most ordinary places. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person serving the champagne might have a story worth telling. The Grand Plaza Hotel buzzed with activity like a beehive on steroids. David had never seen the staff move so quickly or look so stressed. Today wasn't just any day, it was the day of the Hartwell Foundation's annual charity gala, the biggest event the hotel hosted all year. "David, I need you on champagne duty in the main entrance," called out Jennifer, the head of catering. Her usually perfect hair was already starting to fray at the edges, and it was only 3 in the afternoon. VIP guests start arriving at 6, and I want everything perfect. David nodded, adjusting his bow tie for the 3rd time. The evening uniform felt stiffer than usual, but he knew tonight demanded nothing less than perfection. He'd heard whispers about who was coming: tech billionaires, movie stars, politicians whose faces he recognized from the news. The kind of people who could buy and sell the entire hotel without blinking. The grand ballroom looked like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars, casting rainbow reflections across the polished marble floor. Round tables draped in pure white linen surrounded the room, each one set with enough silverware to feed a small family. Fresh flowers from some fancy florist downtown filled the air with a sweet, expensive smell, but what caught David's attention, as always, was the piano. Tonight it seemed to glow under the lights, its black surface so perfectly polished he could see his reflection in it. A small stage had been built around it, with professional lighting that made the whole area look like a concert hall. David felt his heart skip a beat. Someone important was going to play tonight. "Hey, David," called out Tony, one of the kitchen staff. "You hear who's performing tonight? Elena Vasquez. My girlfriend loves her music. Says she's like world famous or something." David's stomach dropped. Elena Vasquez. He knew that name well. She was one of the most celebrated pianists in the world, someone who played with orchestras in Vienna and New York, someone who lived the life David had once dreamed of. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the mixture of excitement and jealousy. Rising in his chest, as the afternoon wore on, the hotel transformed into something magical. Red carpet rolled out from the main entrance to the ballroom. Photographers set up their equipment, testing flashes and adjusting lenses. Security guards in dark suits took their positions, speaking quietly into earpieces. David watched it all. From the service quarters, feeling like he was witnessing the preparation for a royal wedding, the first guests began arriving right on time. David took his position near the entrance, champagne flutes arranged perfectly on his silver tray. He'd learned over the years to keep his face neutral, to blend into the background while still being available when needed. But tonight he couldn't. Help stealing glances at the famous faces walking past. There was the tech mogul whose company he used every day on his phone. The actress whose movies he'd watched in the cheap seats at the local theater. A senator whose speeches he'd seen on the news. They all moved with a confidence David envied, talking and laughing like they owned the world. Which, in many ways, they did. "Excuse me, could I get another glass?" A woman in a sparkling blue dress appeared at his elbow. David recognized her face from magazine covers, some kind of social media influencer with millions of followers. As he handed her a fresh glass, she didn't even look at him. To her, he was just another piece of the scenery. The evening progressed smoothly. David weaved through the crowd, his trained eye catching empty glasses before guests even realized they needed refills. He heard snippets of conversation, business deals worth millions, vacation homes in places he'd never afford to visit, charity donations that were more than he'd make in a lifetime. It was like listening to people speak a foreign language, one where money was no object and dreams always came true. Around 8 o'clock, the energy in the room shifted. People began moving toward their tables, the general mingling giving way to the formal program. David retreated to the service station where he could watch the proceedings while staying ready to serve. The foundation's president, a distinguished man with silver hair, took the stage. He spoke about the charity's mission, about helping underprivileged children access arts education. David felt a bitter irony in that here were the wealthiest people in the city, bidding on art pieces worth more than most people's homes, all in the name of giving poor kids a chance at the arts. "And now," the president announced, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom, "we're honored to present one of the world's most celebrated pianists, Elena Vasquez." The crowd erupted in polite applause. David craned his neck to see the stage, his heart pounding with anticipation. He'd studied her performances online, watched grainy videos of her concerts. This was his chance to see a true master at work, even if it was from the shadows. But instead of the elegant woman in a flowing gown that David expected, a frazzled-looking man in a rumpled suit rushed onto the stage. He whispered urgently into the president's ear, and David watched as the older man's face went pale. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president said, his voice slightly shaky, "I'm afraid we have a small situation. Miss Vasquez has taken ill and won't be able to perform tonight." The room filled with disappointed murmurs. David felt his own disappointment sharp and unexpected. He'd been looking forward to hearing her play, to witnessing greatness up close. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. David watched from the service area as hotel staff ran around like headless chickens. Jennifer was on her phone, frantically calling what sounded like every musician in the city. The foundation president paced back and forth, clearly panicking about how to salvage the evening's centerpiece. "What are we going to do?" David heard the hotel manager ask Jennifer. "These people paid thousands to be here. We can't just skip the entertainment." "I'm trying everyone I know," Jennifer replied, her voice tight with stress. "But it's Saturday night. Every decent pianist in the city is already booked, and the ones who aren't, well, they're not exactly gala material." David felt his palms start to sweat. The piano sat there on the stage, abandoned and silent, like it was waiting for someone to bring it to life. The guests were getting restless, their polite conversations becoming more forced as they realized something was wrong. This was supposed to be the highlight of the evening, the moment when everyone would sit in appreciative silence, transported by beautiful music. Instead, it was turning into a disaster that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. David's fingers twitched at his sides, muscle memory responding to the sight of the piano. He could play everything Elena Vasquez had planned and more. He could save this evening, turn disaster into triumph. But who was he kidding? He was just the help, invisible and forgotten. The stage lights dimmed slightly, as if the piano itself was giving up hope. And in that moment, David felt something stir inside him. A feeling he'd buried under 3 years of serving champagne and swallowing his pride. It was the feeling of possibility, dangerous and intoxicating. The question was, did he have the courage to do something about it? David's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the chaos unfold from the service area. Jennifer was still on her phone, her voice getting more desperate with each call. The foundation president kept checking his watch, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Meanwhile, the guests were starting to whisper among themselves, their polite smiles becoming strained. "No, I understand you're booked," Jennifer was saying into her phone. "But this is an emergency. The Hartwell Foundation Gala. Yes, I know it's short notice." She hung up and immediately dialed another number, her fingers shaking slightly. David couldn't take his eyes off the piano. It sat there under the stage lights, silent and waiting. He knew every piece Elena Vasquez had planned to play tonight. He'd looked up her usual repertoire online earlier in the week, curious about what the wealthy guests would be hearing. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Debussy's Clair de Lune, maybe some Rachmaninoff. Beautiful pieces that he'd played hundreds of times in his tiny apartment, on his second-hand keyboard that could barely hold a tune, but this wasn't his world. He was just the guy who served the champagne, who cleaned up after the real stars had left the building. What was he thinking? "David, can you help me move some of these chairs?" Rosa appeared at his elbow, startling him out of his thoughts. She was working the event too, part of the housekeeping team that would clean up after the guests went home to their mansions. "Sure," David said, but his voice came out croaky. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where do you need them?" As they worked together, moving chairs to make space for the disappointed guests to mingle, Rosa studied his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey. What's wrong?" David glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "The pianist who was supposed to play tonight, she's sick. They can't find a replacement," Rosa shrugged. "These rich folks will survive one night without their fancy music. They'll just talk about their yachts instead." But David couldn't let it go. He kept thinking about the foundation president's speech, about giving underprivileged kids a chance at arts education. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, someone who'd actually lived that dream and lost it, watching it all fall apart. "I could do it," he whispered, almost to himself. "What?" Rosa stopped moving chairs and looked at him directly. David felt his face heat up. "Nothing, I was thinking out loud." But Rosa's eyes were sharp. She'd raised 4 kids and worked 2 jobs for most of her life. She knew when someone was holding back. "David, honey, what aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, Mr. Peterson, the hotel manager, appeared looking frazzled. "David, I need you to go to the storage room and get more champagne. We're going to need it if we're going to salvage this evening." David nodded and headed toward the service elevator, but Rosa caught his arm. "We're not done talking," she said quietly. The storage room was quiet and cool, a sharp contrast to the tension in the ballroom. David stood among the boxes of champagne, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He could still hear the muffled sounds of the party above, polite conversation, the clink of glasses, the gentle hum of people trying to pretend everything was normal, but it wasn't normal. Tonight was supposed to be special, and it was turning into a disaster dot when he returned with the champagne. The situation had gotten worse. Jennifer was off the phone, her face pale. The foundation president was pacing near the stage, talking urgently to the hotel manager. David could see guests starting to check their phones, clearly debating whether to leave early. "Any luck?" Mr. Peterson asked Jennifer. "Nothing," she replied, her voice tight. "It's Saturday night. Every professional pianist in the city is either performing somewhere else or, well, let's just say the ones who are available aren't exactly Hartwell Foundation material." David felt something twist in his stomach. What did that mean exactly? That only certain people were good enough to play for these guests? that someone like him, who'd actually studied at one of the best music schools in the country, wasn't suitable because he happened to wear a service uniform? We could just skip the musical portion, the hotel manager suggested. Move straight to the auction. Absolutely not, the foundation president interjected. Music is what this foundation is about. We can't just abandon it because of one setback. David watched this conversation unfold, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Every instinct told him to keep quiet, to stay in his lane, to remember his place. But another part of him, the part that still woke up with melodies in his head, that still felt the phantom sensation of piano keys under his screaming at him to speak up. Rosa appeared beside him again, carrying a tray of empty glasses. "You're doing it again," she said quietly. "Doing what?" "Looking like you want to say something, but you're too scared to say it." David opened his mouth, then closed it again. "It's complicated. Honey, I've been working in hotels for 20 years. I've seen complicated. This looks like something else entirely." Before David could respond, Jennifer's voice cut through the air. "Wait, what about the piano teacher from the community center? The one who sometimes plays at the hotel restaurant?" "She's out of town," Mr. Peterson replied. "Remember? She mentioned it last week." David felt the words bubbling up in his chest, fighting to get out. He thought about his parents, working extra shifts to pay for his music lessons when he was little. He thought about his grandmother, clapping enthusiastically from the front row at his first recital. He thought about all the dreams he'd buried under 3 years of serving other people's success. "I can do it," he said, so quietly that only Rosa heard him. "What did you say?" she asked. David took a shaky breath. "I said I can do it." "Do what?" "Play the piano." Rosa's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" The conversation between the hotel staff continued around them, voices getting more stressed by the minute. David watched the foundation president check his watch again, saw the disappointment on his face. This was a man who genuinely cared about his cause, who had probably planned this evening for months. "How well can you play?" Rosa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David thought about all those late nights in the empty ballroom, his fingers finding their way across the keys in the dark. "Well enough." "Then why are you whispering to me instead of talking to them?" It was a good question. David looked at Jennifer, still frantically trying to solve the problem. He looked at the hotel manager, clearly out of his depth. He looked at the foundation president, who was now staring at the silent piano like it had personally betrayed him. "Because," David said slowly, "I'm just the help. They're not going to listen to me." Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, the same smile she gave her grandchildren when they were being silly. "Honey, sometimes the help knows exactly what needs to be done. The question is whether you're brave enough to do it." She was right, and David knew it. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the awareness that his entire life might change in the next few minutes. He could play it safe, keep his head down, and watch the evening crumble. Or he could take the biggest risk of his life and step out of the shadows. The piano waited on the stage, patient and beautiful, like it had been waiting for him all along. David's legs felt like jelly as he walked toward Jennifer and the hotel manager. Each step seemed to take forever, and he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Rosa followed behind him, giving him a gentle push of encouragement when he hesitated. "Excuse me," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer and Mr. Peterson were deep in conversation and didn't hear him. The foundation president was still staring at the piano, probably wondering how he was going to explain this disaster to his board of directors. "Excuse me," David tried again, a little louder this time. Mr. Peterson looked up, clearly annoyed. "David, not now. We're dealing with a crisis here." "I know, sir. That's why I wanted to talk to you." Jennifer looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "David, we need to find a professional pianist, not discuss your work schedule." David's mouth went dry. This was harder than he'd imagined. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. I can play piano." The words hung in the air like a bad joke. Mr. Peterson blinked slowly, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Jennifer actually laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "David, this isn't the time for jokes," she said. "We need someone who can perform. For 300 VIP guests, not someone who can plunk out happy birthday at a staff party." David felt his face burn with embarrassment, but Rosa stepped forward. "Let the boy speak," she said firmly. "He's trying to help." "I went to Juilliard," David said quickly, before he could lose his nerve. "I studied classical piano for 4 years. I can play everything Elena Vasquez was going to play tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. David could hear the distant sound of conversation from the ballroom, the clink of glasses, the gentle hum of people trying to pretend everything was normal. But in their little circle, time seemed to have stopped. Mr. Peterson was the first to speak. "You went to Juilliard, the music school in New York?" David nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "And you're working as a server?" Jennifer asked, clearly skeptical. "Things happen," David said quietly. "Family problems. I had to leave school, had to find work, but I never stopped playing." The foundation president had overheard the conversation and walked over to join them. "Did I hear correctly? You're saying you can perform tonight?" David looked at the man who'd been pacing with worry just moments before. "Yes, sir, I know the pieces. I've been practicing them for years." "This is insane," Jennifer muttered. "We can't put a server on stage in front of these people. What will they think?" "They'll think we solved the problem," Rosa said firmly. "And maybe they'll learn something about not judging people by their uniforms." Mr. Peterson was studying David's face intently. "You're serious about this? You really think you can pull this off?" David thought about all those late nights in the empty ballroom, his fingers finding their way across the keys in the dark. He thought about the years of training, the muscle memory that never really went away. "I can do it, sir. I know I can." "But what about ... presentation?" Jennifer gestured at David's server uniform. "He can't go on stage looking like that." "The hotel manager's spare tuxedo is in his office," Mr. Peterson said slowly. "It might fit." "Are you actually considering this?" Jennifer asked, her voice rising slightly. Before Mr. Peterson could answer, the foundation president spoke up. "What's your name, son?" "David, sir." "David, I need you to understand something. This isn't just any performance. These people have paid a lot of money to be here tonight. They're expecting excellence. If you go up there and... well, if it doesn't go well, it could be very embarrassing for everyone involved." David felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. "I understand, sir. But I also understand that right now, you don't have any other options." The man smiled for the first time all evening. "You're right about that." He turned to Mr. Peterson. "How quickly can we get him ready?" Wait, Jennifer interrupted. "We're really doing this. We're putting a server on stage. We're giving a trained musician a chance to save the evening," the foundation president corrected. "Background doesn't matter. Talent does." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. David found himself whisked away to Mr. Peterson's office, where he changed into a tuxedo that was only slightly too big. Rosa helped him adjust the bow tie, her hands gentle and sure. "You look like a different person," she said, stepping back. To admire her work, David looked at himself in the mirror. The tuxedo transformed him, made him look like someone who belonged on a stage. But inside, he was still the same scared kid who'd been serving champagne an hour ago. "What if I mess up?" he asked Rosa. "What if I forget the pieces or my hands shake too much?" "Then you mess up," she said simply. "But, honey, you've been messing up for 3 years by hiding who you really are. At least tonight, you're messing up while being yourself." Back in the ballroom, Mr. Peterson had taken the stage to address the guests. David watched from the wings, his hands trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Peterson began, "I know you've been patient with us tonight, and I want to thank you for that. While we weren't able to secure our originally planned performer, we found someone else who I think will surprise you." David heard murmurs from the crowd, saw people turning to look at each other with raised eyebrows. These weren't people who liked surprises, especially not at events they'd paid premium prices to attend. Tonight's performer studied at Juilliard School of Music, Mr. Peterson continued, and has been perfecting his craft for many years. Please join me in welcoming David to the stage. David took a deep breath and stepped into the lights. The ballroom seemed enormous from the stage, filled with faces he couldn't quite make out in the darkness beyond the spotlight. He heard scattered, polite applause, but also confused whispers. "Isn't that our server?" he heard someone say. "What is this amateur hour?" Came another voice. David's steps faltered for just a moment. These people had seen him serving their drinks, cleaning their tables. To them, he was invisible, just part of the background. Now he was supposed to be the star of the show. He reached the piano bench and sat down, his hands hovering over the keys. The instrument was even more beautiful up close, its surface reflecting the stage lights like a mirror. David had dreamed of playing a piano like this, had imagined it countless times during those lonely nights in his apartment. The ballroom fell silent. 300 pairs of eyes watching him. He could feel their skepticism, their doubt. Some people were already reaching for their phones, probably ready to leave if this turned into a disaster. David placed his fingers on the keys. And for a moment, everything else disappeared. This was it. This was his moment to show the world who he really was. Underneath the uniform and the humble job and the buried dreams, he began to play. The first note floated through the ballroom like a whisper, pure and clear. David's fingers found Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece he'd played so many times he could do it in his sleep. But tonight on this magnificent piano, it felt like he was discovering the music for the first time. The skeptical murmurs from the crowd began to fade. David could feel the change in the room's energy, like the moment when a storm cloud breaks and sunlight streams through. His nervousness started to melt away as the familiar melody filled the space, each note ringing out with perfect clarity. He closed his eyes and let the music take over. This was where he belonged, where he'd always belonged. The tuxedo, the stage, lights, the beautiful piano, it all felt right in a way that serving champagne never had. His hands moved across the keys with the confidence of years of training, muscle memory guiding him through passages he'd practiced thousands of times. The audience was completely silent now. David could sense their attention, their growing amazement. He opened his eyes briefly and saw faces that had been bored or annoyed just minutes before, now watching him with genuine interest. The woman in the sparkling blue dress, who hadn't even looked at him when he served her champagne, was leaning forward in her chair, completely captivated. As the nocturne reached its gentle conclusion, David transitioned seamlessly into Debussy's Clair de Lune. The piece was like liquid moonlight, flowing and mysterious. He'd always loved this one, had played it for his grandmother in her final days when words weren't enough, but music could still reach her, somewhere in the third row. David noticed a woman dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Near the back, a man who'd been checking his phone all evening had put it away completely, his full attention on the stage. The transformation was magical, a room full of strangers becoming a community. United by the power of music, David felt tears welling up in his own eyes, but he kept playing. 3 years of buried dreams, of pretending to be someone else, of hiding his true self, it all poured out through his fingertips. This wasn't just a performance. It was a homecoming for his final piece. David chose Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but arranged for solo piano. It was ambitious, maybe even risky, but tonight felt like a night for taking risks. The piece started softly, almost hesitantly, like someone gathering courage to speak their truth. Then it built, became bolder, more confident, until the melody soared with all the passion and longing David had kept locked inside for so long. The music filled every corner of the ballroom, every heart in the room. David played like his life depended on it, because in a way, it did. This was his chance to show the world who he really was, to prove that dreams don't die just because life gets hard. As the final notes echoed through the silence, David lifted his hands from the keys. For a moment, the ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then, like a dam bursting, the applause erupted. It wasn't the polite clapping of a fancy charity dinner. It was raw, emotional, genuine appreciation. People jumped to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. The tech mogul was clapping enthusiastically. The senator was nodding with approval. and the social media influencer was recording everything on her phone with a huge smile on her face. David stood up slowly, hardly believing what was happening. The applause seemed to go on forever, washing over him like a warm embrace. He saw Rosa in the back, tears streaming down her face as she clapped proudly. Mr. Peterson looked stunned, and even Jennifer was applauding, her earlier skepticism completely forgotten. But the most meaningful moment came when the foundation president joined him on stage. The older man's eyes were bright with emotion as he shook David's hand. "Son," he said, his voice carrying over the continuing applause, "that was absolutely extraordinary. In 30 years of hosting this gala, I've never heard anything more beautiful." The crowd gradually settled down, but the energy in the room had completely changed. People were talking excitedly at their tables, their faces animated in a way they hadn't been all evening. David had given them something unexpected, something real, and they'd responded with their hearts. As David made his way off stage, still in a daze, he was stopped by an elegant woman with silver hair. She introduced herself as Victoria Sterling, a name he recognized from arts magazines. She was a major patron of classical music, someone who discovered and promoted young talent. "David," she said, pressing a business card into his hand, "we need to talk. Soon? I think you have a bright future ahead of you." More people approached him as he moved through the crowd. A recording executive wanted to discuss opportunities. A concert promoter talked about upcoming shows that needed a featured pianist. The same people who had looked right through him an hour ago were now treating him like a star, but the conversation that meant the most happened later. As the guests were leaving and David was changing back into his server uniform, his phone rang. It was his parents calling from their small town 3 hours away. "David, honey, you'll never believe what happened." His mother's voice was excited, confused. "My friend Linda just called. She said she saw a video online of someone who looks exactly like you playing piano at some fancy hotel. It's impossible, but..." David smiled, looking at himself in the mirror. Half changed, bow tie hanging loose around his neck, he looked like he was caught between two worlds. "Mom," he said quietly, "it's not impossible. It was me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like forever. Then his father's voice came through, shaky with emotion. "Son, are you telling us you're still playing? After all these years?" "I never stopped, Dad. I got lost for a while. Within a week, David's life had changed completely. The video of his performance had gone viral, shared millions of times across social media. Music blogs wrote articles about the server who stunned a ballroom. Classical music stations played recordings of his impromptu concert. Victoria Sterling arranged for him to audition with the City Symphony Orchestra. A major record label offered him a contract. Venues that had once seemed impossible to reach were suddenly opening their doors, but perhaps the most important change was the one inside David himself. He'd stopped hiding, stopped pretending to be less than he was. The scared young man who served champagne was still part of him, but now he was integrated with the musician he'd always been meant to be. 6 months later, David returned to the Grand Plaza Hotel, but this time as the featured performer at their anniversary celebration. He walked across the same stage where his life had changed, sat at the same piano that had welcomed him home as he played for another captivated audience. David thought about that night when everything shifted. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the person serving your champagne has a story that could change your life. And sometimes all it takes is the courage to step into the light and show the world who you really are, the piano sang. Under his fingers, and David smiled, finally home.